"Is there room in your bed?" She said it standing in his doorway at 2 a.m. Soaked barefoot, 61 years old, holding a cracked picture frame against her chest like it was the last thing she owned that still told the truth about who she was. Thomas Calloway had not let anyone need him in 3 years. Not since the funeral. Not since he'd learned that being needed and losing someone felt like the same wound. He looked at this woman he had never spoken to, and something in him, something he thought was finished, cracked open. "Only," he said, "if you won't be gone before morning. If that line already hit you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city below. I want to see how far this story travels." The knock came at 2:06 a.m. Not the polite kind. Not the sorry to bother you kind. The kind that comes from a hand that's been shaking for hours and finally just gave up being careful. Thomas Calloway heard it from the kitchen where he'd been standing for 40 minutes over a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, staring at a legal document he couldn't finish reading in an apartment that had too many rooms for one man who kept telling himself he preferred it that way. He was 58, CEO of Calloway and Reed Construction. He had negotiated with men who wanted to destroy him and smiled until they ran out of patience. He did not startle. He startled. He got to the door, looked through the peephole. A woman. Silver hair soaked through one hand pressed flat against his door like she needed it to hold her up. The other arm clutched a picture frame to her chest. Cracked down the center glass, fractured, but not yet fallen. He did not know her. He opened the door anyway. She looked up, and what crossed her face in that single second was the most honest thing Thomas Calloway had seen in 3 years: relief and shame, arriving at exactly the same moment, fighting each other for the same expression, neither one winning. "I know," she said immediately. "I know exactly how this looks." "How does it look?" Thomas asked. She blinked. She hadn't expected that. "Like a woman who has completely lost her grip on her dignity. Or," Thomas said, "like a woman who needed somewhere to be." She stared at him. Her name, he would learn in the next 30 seconds, was Margaret Reed. She had moved into apartment 4B the previous afternoon. He'd heard the elevator running, heard the wheels of a single suitcase in the hallway, heard the particular silence of someone unpacking alone. Mrs. Brooks downstairs had mentioned a new tenant with real furniture sense and sad eyes, which was the most information Thomas had received about another human being in several months. "My ceiling is leaking," Margaret said. "Through the light fixture. I put towels down, but—" She stopped. "I think it might be a fire hazard." "It is," Thomas said. "The building manager isn't answering." "He won't until 8, Thomas said. "Come in." "I can't just—" "The floor under a leaking light fixture conducts electricity," Thomas said. "Come in, Margaret." The way he said her name, not commanding, not gentle exactly, just certain, made her stop arguing. She stepped inside. She kept the picture frame pressed to her chest. He noticed she didn't put it down for a very long time. He made coffee. She sat at his kitchen table and watched him like she was trying to figure out what he wanted. That was the thing Thomas noticed first, not her exhaustion, not her wet clothes, not even the cracked frame. It was the watching, the careful, constant, slightly braced quality of her attention. The way a person looks when they've learned that kindness usually comes with a price tag attached somewhere you can't see yet. "You don't have to stay at the table," Thomas said. "You can move to the couch, or just wherever you're comfortable." "I'm fine," she said. Then immediately, "Sorry, I'm fine, thank you." "You just apologized for saying you were fine," Thomas observed. She opened her mouth, closed it. "Old habit," she said. "How old?" She looked at him across the kitchen. 31 years. The coffee maker finished. Thomas poured 2 cups, brought them to the table, and sat down across from her. He did not ask her to explain. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or questions or the particular social noise that people use to avoid sitting in the truth of a moment. He just sat. And something about that, the simple, undemanding presence of it, made Margaret Reed's shoulders drop approximately 1 inch. which Thomas suspected was enormous. "My ex-husband," she said finally, not because he'd asked, but because the silence had made space for it. "He thinks calling enough times is a form of argument. Does he win that way?" "He used to." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "He won't tonight." Her phone lit up on the table. Derek calling. Neither of them moved. It rang 4 times. 5. The screen stayed lit, that name sitting there like something that refused to understand it wasn't welcome. Then it stopped. Margaret exhaled. One breath. Controlled practice, the kind of exhale that's been trained by years of not being allowed to exhale too loudly. "He'll call back," she said. "Probably." Thomas agreed. "Doesn't that concern you? A stranger in your apartment with a complicated ex-husband?" Thomas looked at her steadily. "Should it?" She studied him. Most people would at least ask. "I'm asking now," Thomas said. "Is there anything I should be concerned about?" A pause. "He's not violent," Margaret said. "He's just—" She stopped, looked at the mug. "He's the kind of man who never raises his voice, who never says anything you can point to, who just quietly, over a very long time, makes you into someone smaller." Thomas set his mug down. "I had a manager like that once," he said. She looked up. Senior level. Brilliant. Never shouted, never threatened. But every meeting he ran, people left it feeling behind, feeling wrong, feeling like whatever they'd brought wasn't quite enough. Thomas paused. "I fired him." "You can't fire a husband," Margaret said. "No," Thomas said. "But 3 weeks ago, apparently, you left one." Her eyes went sharp. "How did you—" "Mrs. Brooks," Thomas said simply. "She's very well informed." A beat. Then, despite everything, despite the wet coat and the cracked frame and the phone that kept lighting up with a name she'd spent 31 years answering, Margaret Reed laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, but it was real. Thomas thought it was probably the best sound he'd heard in this apartment since he'd moved in. Derek calling. This time, Margaret picked it up. Thomas watched her thumb hover over the screen for exactly 3 seconds. Then she pressed decline with the deliberate calm of someone making a decision they've rehearsed 100 times and are finally actually making. She set the phone face down on the table. "He'll tell my daughter I'm unstable," she said quietly. "He's probably already called her." "What will your daughter think?" "Lily is smart," Margaret said. "She loves her father. She's also starting to notice things." A pause. "She called me last week and asked if I was actually okay, or if I was doing the thing I do where I say I'm fine." "What did you say?" "I said I was fine." "Were you?" Margaret looked at him steadily. "I was in a parking lot sitting in my car because I couldn't go back inside my own house, so no." The word landed in the kitchen and stayed there. Thomas picked up his coffee. He didn't say "I'm sorry," or "that must have been hard," or any of the things people say when they want to acknowledge pain without actually standing next to it. He just nodded once. The nod of someone who receives information and treats it seriously. "Why did you leave when you did?" he asked. "After 31 years, why that moment?" Margaret was quiet for a long time. She looked at the picture frame still face down beside her elbow. "Can I show you something?" she asked. "Yes." She turned the frame over. A photograph, faded soft at the edges, taken in a classroom bright with children's drawings and small colorful chairs. In the center of it, a younger Margaret, mid-30s, maybe hair dark, wearing a yellow cardigan, was kneeling beside a little girl who held up a drawing with both hands. The little girl's face was lit with the particular pride of a child who has made something and cannot wait for it to be seen. And younger Margaret was laughing, not posing, not performing, but actually laughing, the kind that happens before you remember anyone might be watching. Thomas looked at it for a long moment. "Teaching," he said. 26 years, 3rd grade. Margaret's voice was careful. "Derek thought it was beneath what I could have been doing. He never said it like that. He said things like, "Are you sure you want to spend your energy on other people's children? And you could have gone further if you hadn't settled." He said it so many times, so reasonably, that I started saying it to myself. "When did you stop teaching?" She looked at the photo. 6 years ago. "When did you stop believing him?" She looked up at Thomas. 3 weeks ago, she said. "In a parking lot, in my car. When I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done a single thing because I wanted to." The refrigerator hummed. The rain moved against the windows. "That's why you took the frame," Thomas said. "I needed to remember." Margaret said, "Who I was before I decided someone else's version of me was easier to be." Thomas looked at the photograph. The laughing woman in the yellow cardigan. The little girl's drawing. The room full of color. "You should go back," he said. "To teaching. I'm 61. "What does 61 have to do with it?" "The certification requirements have changed. The schools have changed. I've been out 6. "Margaret." He waited until she looked at him. "What's actually stopping you?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "I'm terrified," she said, quietly, like she was confessing something she hadn't let herself say out loud before. "What if I go back and I'm not? What if I'm not her anymore? What if he was right and what if 6 years is too long, and the thing that made me good at it is just gone?" Her voice broke on the last word, just slightly, just enough. Thomas did not rush to fix it. He let the break be there. He let it mean something. And then after a moment he said, "The woman in that photograph is still in there." Margaret went very still. "You can see her right now," Thomas said. "The way you talked to the building manager when you called earlier. The way you explained the leak, clear, specific, zero nonsense. That's a woman who spent 26 years being the person 23 8-year-olds could count on." He paused. "That doesn't disappear. It goes quiet. That's different." Her eyes went bright, and she didn't try to stop it. "That's a terrible thing," she said, her voice unsteady. "To say to someone who is trying very hard not to cry in front of a person she met 4 hours ago." "Technically," Thomas said, "I think at 4 hours we've moved past person you met." "What have we moved to?" He considered it. "Neighbor who knows something real about you." She laughed again, that same surprised, slightly broken quality. She pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth and breathed. And then her phone lit up. Not Derek. Lily calling. Margaret answered on the second ring. "Lily." "Mom, Dad called me." Her daughter's voice came through fast, concerned, already running. He said you had some kind of episode and you're staying with someone you don't even know and..." "Lily." Margaret's voice shifted into something steady and clear. Not defensive, not apologetic. Clear. "I am sitting in my neighbor's kitchen drinking coffee because my ceiling is leaking. That is the entire situation." He said, "I know what he said." A breath. "Your father has a version of every story I'm in. His version always ends with me needing to be managed. I'm asking you to hold space for the possibility that his version isn't the whole story." Silence from Lily. Then, "Are you okay?" "Actually, I'm more okay," Margaret said, "than I have been in a very long time." "Who's the neighbor?" Margaret glanced at Thomas. He raised his eyebrows slightly, giving nothing away. "His name is Thomas," she said. "He opened the door. He made coffee. He hasn't tried to tell me what to do yet, which puts him ahead of most people in my life." A pause from Lily, then quietly, "Okay, call me tomorrow. First thing," Margaret said. "I love you." She hung up. She put the phone down. She looked at Thomas. "Most people," she said. "You haven't tried to tell me what to do yet," I said. "That puts you ahead of most people in my life." She tilted her head slightly. "Is that going to change?" Thomas picked up his coffee cup. "I told you to come inside. I told you to sit down. I told you to go back to teaching." "That's advice," he said. "Not instruction. There's a difference. She studied him. What is the difference? Advice. Thomas said, you can take or leave. It doesn't change how I see you either way. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The careful reading look, the one searching for the catch, the angle, the real price underneath the apparent kindness. She didn't find one. Okay, she said softly. At just past 3 in the morning, Thomas set her up on the couch. Good pillow, warm blanket, glass of water on the side table. He said goodnight without hovering. No performance of generosity. No waiting to be thanked. He went to his room. He lay in the dark. He thought about a woman who had apologized for saying she was fine. Who had turned off her phone like it was an act of reclamation. Who had carried a cracked picture frame through a storm because it held the last image of herself she fully recognized. He thought about Sarah. About how grief had made him so efficient. How he'd learned to be excellent at everything that didn't require him to feel. His daughter called it building walls and calling them architecture. He had said, that's not a real phrase. She had said, it is now. He almost smiled in the dark. He thought, I opened the door. That was all. He'd just opened the door. He wasn't reading into it. He wasn't. His thoughts slowed. Somewhere in the apartment, he could hear the quiet sound of Margaret breathing. Even, finally calm. He hadn't heard another person breathing in his apartment in 3 years. He lay very still and let himself notice that. Then at some point he couldn't name, he slept. At 6:11 a.m., Thomas heard the soft, specific sound of someone trying to leave without being heard. The particular silence of held breath. The creak of the floor near the entry. The slow, careful turn of a deadbolt. He was out of bed before his brain caught up. He came down the hall and found her at the front door, shoes. In one hand, coat folded over her arm, cracked picture frame tucked under her elbow. Her hand was on the door handle. She was 2 seconds from gone. The coffee's already on, Thomas said. She stopped. He watched her shoulders rise. Then slowly the long exhale of someone caught in the middle of running from something they didn't want to name fall. She turned around. She looked at him. The expression on her face was complicated in the way that only years can make an expression complicated, exhausted and composed, and slightly ashamed and slightly defiant, and underneath all of it, something raw and real that she was trying very hard to keep behind her eyes. I was trying, she said, not to become a problem. You're not a problem, Thomas said. You have a life. You have work. I showed up at your door in the middle of the night and slept on your couch and... Margaret. She stopped. His voice was very quiet, very even. The voice she would think later of a man who has had to learn the difference between raising his volume and raising his certainty. Needing one safe place, he said, does not make you a problem. It makes you human. She stared at him. Put your shoes down, he said. Come drink coffee, and then you can make whatever decisions you want. But you're not leaving without saying goodbye. A long moment. She put her shoes down. She followed him to the kitchen. And outside, without either of them noticing exactly when it had happened, the rain had stopped. The street below was wet and quiet, and beginning very slowly in the gray blue of early morning to catch the first suggestion of light. Something that had been locked for a very long time hadn't opened yet. But it had moved. The ceiling in 4B was repaired by noon. Thomas had made the call at 8 sharp, and the maintenance crew arrived at 9:45 with that particular energy of men who had been told very clearly, very specifically, by someone whose name they recognized, that this was not optional. Margaret stood in her apartment doorway and watched them work, and Thomas stood slightly behind her, close enough to be present, far enough to not be in charge of it. That distinction mattered. She noticed it. When the crew left, she walked back into her apartment and stood in the middle of it for a moment. The boxes were still damp at the corners. The children's books were spread out on the dry counter where Thomas had moved them earlier. Charlotte's Web, The Velveteen Rabbit. Sarah, plain and tall, lined up with a care that looked almost deliberate, like someone had understood that they mattered. You moved these, she said. They were going to warp, Thomas said from the doorway. She looked at the books for a moment. My mother gave me Charlotte's Web when I started student teaching. She said, "If you can get through the end of that book without crying, you're too tough to teach children." Can you get through the end without crying? She picked it up. Not once. Not in 30 years. She set it back down. Derek thought that was embarrassing. Thomas said nothing. He said, "It's a children's book, Margaret. You're a grown woman." She said it in a voice slightly flatter than her own practiced precise, the vocal impression of a person heard too many times. I stopped reading it in front of him after that. How many other things did you stop doing in front of him? The question came out quiet and direct, and she turned to look at Thomas with an expression that said she hadn't expected it. Not the question itself, but the fact that someone was asking it like the answer was information worth having. More than I realized, she said, until I started counting. They stood in her apartment among the damp boxes and the rescued books, and the question sat between them like something that needed to be taken seriously, so they both took it seriously. That was the thing about Thomas Calloway that Margaret was beginning to map the edges of. He didn't move past things. He didn't smooth them over or redirect or offer solutions before the problem had been fully said out loud. He just stayed, inside the moment. Like he had nowhere more important to be, which she suspected was not actually true, but which he made feel true, and that was its own kind of gift. Her phone buzzed. Both of them looked at it on the counter. Derek. Again. Margaret reached over and moved it to the drawer. Closed it. "He'll stop eventually," she said, but she said it like a thing she was trying to convince herself of. "Does he know where you moved?" Thomas asked. "No." A pause. "But he knows I'm in this building. I made the mistake of telling Lily and Lily she loves us both. She doesn't mean to carry information between us. She just doesn't realize yet that she is. Have you told Lily not to? I don't want to put her in that position." "She's already in that position," Thomas said. "The question is whether she's navigating it with information or without it." Margaret looked at him. "You're very direct. Is that a problem?" She considered it seriously. "No," she said. "It's disorienting, but not a problem." She picked up Charlotte's Web again, turned it over in her hands. "I used to read aloud to my class every Friday afternoon. The last hour before the weekend. The kids would drag their chairs into a circle and just listen." She stopped. "I was good at it, the reading aloud. I did voices." "What kind of voices?" She glanced at him sideways. "Don't." "I didn't say anything." "You were going to ask me to demonstrate." "I was absolutely going to ask you to demonstrate," Thomas admitted. And there it was again, that surprised laugh, short and real, the kind that came before she had time to decide whether levity was appropriate. Thomas had decided privately that the speed of that laugh was a measurement of something. The faster it came, the more herself she was being. "Wilbur sounded nervous," she said finally, not quite looking at him. "Anxious, but hopeful. Charlotte sounded like someone who knew more than she was saying, but said exactly the right amount. That sounds," Thomas said carefully, "like someone I know." She looked at him. He held it for exactly the right amount of time, not long enough to make it heavy, just long enough to mean it, and then turned toward the hallway. "Come downstairs," he said. "I want you to meet someone properly." Mrs. Eleanor Brooks was 81 years old, 4'11", and under the impression that she ran the building, which was not technically true and was also completely accurate. She had lived in apartment 2A for 37 years, outlasted 4 building managers and 2 ownership changes, and maintained a detailed mental file on every resident that she updated continuously through a combination of observation conversation and what she referred to as reasonable inference. She opened her door before Thomas knocked, which Margaret found startling, and Thomas clearly did not. "I heard the crew leave," Mrs. Brooks said, looking past Thomas directly at Margaret. "Is it fixed?" "It's fixed," Thomas said. "Good. I told them when they moved you in that that unit had ceiling history." Mrs. Brooks held out her hand to Margaret. Eleanor Brooks. I would have come up yesterday, but my hip had opinions about the stairs. Margaret Reed, Margaret said, shaking the offered hand, which had a grip considerably firmer than expected. I know who you are. You moved in with 3 boxes of books, and a look on your face I recognized immediately. Mrs. Brooks turned and walked back into her apartment in the clear expectation that they would follow. They followed. Sit. I made too much coffee as always because making too much coffee is the last remaining pleasure of living alone that hasn't been taken from me. They sat. Mrs. Brooks poured 3 cups with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing exactly this for 40 years and set them on the table without asking preferences. The look, Margaret said carefully. You said you recognized it. Starting over look, Mrs. Brooks said simply. I wore it myself at 53. Moved into this building with a suitcase and my daughter's old lamp and enough anger to power the elevator. She took her seat. My husband wasn't a bad man either. Just a man who took up all the oxygen in every room and never noticed I was turning blue. Margaret set her cup down slowly. What did you do? She asked. After. Got a job at the library. Learned to play piano badly. Made friends with people who thought I was interesting instead of manageable. Mrs. Brooks looked at her directly. Took about 2 years to stop flinching every time someone said my name too loudly. 2 years, Margaret said quietly. Don't let that discourage you. The first 3 months are the worst. Everything feels like failure. Your nervous system is still running the old program. Mrs. Brooks picked up her cup. Then one morning, you wake up and you make your coffee exactly the way you like it, and no one comments on it, and you realize that's what peace feels like. It's almost boring. And it's the best thing you've ever had. Thomas was quiet throughout this. Not absent, Margaret could feel him there, present listening, but understanding that this particular conversation didn't belong to him. That he was a witness, not a participant. She found that notable. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at it. Lily this time. She answered. Mom. He called me again. Lily's voice was trying to stay neutral and not quite managing it. He said you had coffee with a man this morning and that you're not thinking clearly and that he's worried. He's surveilling me through you, Margaret said quietly. Lily, do you understand that? He doesn't call you because he's worried. He calls you to keep a map of where I am. A silence on the other end. Then, that's not he loves you, Mom. I know he does, Margaret said. That's not the same as not doing it. Mrs. Brooks was watching her with an expression that was not pity, it was recognition. Thomas was looking at his cup. He's trying to come get you, Lily said. He asked me for the address. Margaret's hand went still on the phone. Did you give it to him? No, Mom, I didn't. But he said, Lily! She said her daughter's name the way she used to say the names of students who needed to slow down and hear the whole sentence. I need you to trust me, not because I'm your mother, because you've watched me for 30 years and somewhere in there you've seen enough to know when I'm thinking clearly. Am I thinking clearly? A longer silence. Yeah, Lily said finally softly. Yeah, I think you are. Good. I'll call you tonight. Don't give him the address. She hung up. She put the phone on the table and pressed both palms flat against the surface, as if she needed to feel something solid. He's coming, she said. Not panicked, just stating it, processing it. He doesn't know where, Thomas said. He'll figure it out. He's very resourceful that way. She said resourceful with a flatness that carried 31 years of understanding exactly what that resourcefulness had always been used for. Mrs. Brooks reached across the table and put one small, firm hand over Margaret's. Then we know, she said. And knowing is better than being surprised. Margaret spent the afternoon in her apartment. Not hiding, she was clear with herself about that distinction, but settling. She unpacked 3 boxes. She made her bed with the sheets she'd bought last week, the first sheet she'd chosen entirely alone in 12 years. She put the picture frame on the small table by the window facing out. She called the school district office, not to apply, not yet, just to ask about the reinstatement process for lapsed teaching certificates. She used the voice she'd used with the building manager that morning, clear, specific, no excess apology. The woman on the other end gave her 4 steps and a phone number and said, "We need experienced teachers, absolutely call us." Margaret hung up and sat with that for a moment. "We need experienced teachers." She said it once quietly to the empty room. Let it sit. Let it be real. At 4:30, someone knocked on her door. Her whole body went tight before she'd consciously registered the knock. 31 years of a particular kind of attention will do that. Wire your nervous system to read a knock as a verdict before your brain has caught up. She went to the door, looked through the peephole. Thomas, holding a paper bag from the deli down the street. She opened the door. "You didn't eat," he said. "How do you—" "You were in your apartment all afternoon. I didn't hear you leave." She stared at him. Are you monitoring my—" "Old floors," he said. "You learn the sounds of the building. It's not surveillance, it's just awareness." He paused. "There's a difference." She looked at him. The paper bag. The complete absence of drama in his face. No expectation of gratitude. No performance of caring. Just a man who had noticed a thing and done something about it. "Come in," she said. They ate at her kitchen table. Sandwiches, decent coffee she'd made in her own kitchen with her own beans, the way she liked it, which was stronger than Derek had preferred, and which she had been making weak for 9 years, and had only just realized it this week. "I called the school district," she said. Thomas looked up. "Just to ask, about reinstatement." She broke off a corner of her sandwich. 4 steps. They said they need experienced teachers." "Of course they do," Thomas said. "You don't have to say it like it's obvious." "It is obvious." "It doesn't feel obvious. It feels—" She stopped. "It feels like standing at the edge of something and not knowing if the ground is still there." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "When I was building my first major project, a commercial complex downtown, the financing was a mess, and 2 contractors pulled out at the last minute. I stood in that empty lot for about 40 minutes and couldn't move." She looked at him. "My site manager came and stood next to me. He didn't say anything. He didn't tell me it would be fine. He just stood there." Thomas paused. "After a while I started talking through the problem, and somewhere in the talking, the ground came back." "What did he say?" Margaret asked. "Nothing. He just listened." Thomas looked at her. "Sometimes that's all the ground is. Someone staying in the same place long enough for you to find your footing." She looked at him across her kitchen table, in her apartment, among her books and her boxes, and her picture of the woman she was trying to get back to. "Thomas," she said. "Why are you being this kind to me?" He didn't answer immediately. He picked up his coffee. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "My wife's name was Sarah," he said finally. "She was the most competent, generous, capable person I've ever known. And she spent the last 2 years of her illness apologizing for needing help." He stopped. "I kept telling her she didn't have to. She kept apologizing anyway. And I've thought about that a lot in the 3 years since. What makes someone feel like needing help is the thing they have to apologize for." Margaret was very still. "I'm not trying to save you," Thomas said. "I want to be clear about that. I don't think you need saving." He set his cup down. "But I think you knocked on my door at 2 in the morning, and I think you were about to leave at 6 without saying goodbye. And I think you've spent 31 years treating your own needs like inconveniences." He paused. "I'm just not going to pretend I didn't notice." The kitchen was quiet. Something moved through Margaret's face, complicated and quick, the expression of someone who has just been told the truth about themselves by someone who has no angle, no agenda, nothing to gain, and doesn't know what to do with that because it's been so long since that happened. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "I don't know how to let someone be kind to me without waiting for what it costs." "I know," Thomas said. "You don't have to figure it all out today." Her phone rang. The sound of it, the specific ringtone she'd never gotten around to changing the one that had rung in her house for 12 years, made them both go still. She looked at the screen. Not Derek, not Lily. A number she didn't recognize. Local area code. She answered on instinct. Margaret Reed. Yes. This is the front desk at the Clement Street building. There's a gentleman downstairs asking for you. He says his name is Derek Foster. He says he's your husband. The air went out of the room. He's not my husband, Margaret said. Her voice was completely even. That was the strangest part, how even it was, while everything underneath it was not. Please tell him I'm not available. He says it's urgent. It's always urgent, Margaret said. Please tell him I'm not available. If he doesn't leave, please call the non-emergency police line. A beat. Thank you. She hung up. She put the phone on the table. She looked at Thomas. He was looking back at her. And what was on his face was not alarm, not pity, not the particular expression of a man recalculating whether this situation was more than he'd signed up for. It was steadiness. Just steadiness. He's downstairs, she said. I heard. I'm sorry. I brought this to your... Margaret. His voice was quiet. Stop. She stopped. You didn't bring anything, he said. He followed you. Those are different things. She pressed her hands flat on the table again. What do I do? What do you want to do? The question was so simple and so unusual that she actually paused. What did she want? Not what was expected. Not what would calm him down. Not what would avoid conflict. What did she want? I don't want to see him, she said. Then you won't, Thomas said. He won't just, he'll wait. He's very patient when he thinks patience is the tool that works. Thomas nodded slowly. Then we wait longer. He picked up his coffee. You still have half a sandwich. She stared at him. Eat your sandwich, Margaret, he said. He doesn't get to ruin dinner. She looked at the sandwich. She looked at Thomas. She thought about 31 years of interrupted meals of food that went cold, while she navigated his moods of dinners that became negotiations she hadn't known she was entering. She picked up the sandwich. She ate. And downstairs in the lobby of the building on Clement Street, Derek Foster sat in one of the chairs by the elevator and waited with the patience of a man who had always believed that patience was its own form of ownership, that waiting long enough was a kind of answer. What he did not know, what he had perhaps never understood, was that the woman upstairs was not the woman he had been waiting for. That woman had driven away from his house 3 weeks ago with a cracked picture frame and a car full of books. This one was someone else entirely. And she was eating her sandwich. Derek Foster waited 47 minutes. Margaret knew because she watched the clock on her kitchen wall without meaning to, the way you watch something you're trying not to watch. The sandwich was gone. The coffee was gone. Thomas had not left. He'd moved to the chair by the window and was reading something on his phone with the calm of a man who had decided this evening had no other obligations, which she suspected was not true, but which she did not challenge, because some part of her, the part that had spent 31 years managing everything alone, was still learning what it felt like to not have to. At the 47-minute mark, her phone rang again. Front desk. He's still here, Ms. Reed. He's asking if he can leave a note. Margaret looked at Thomas. Tell him no, she said. If he's not gone in 10 minutes, please call building security. She hung up. He left notes, she said to Thomas, not quite to herself. That was his thing. When I was upset when I'd tried to say something was wrong, he'd leave notes. Very reasonable notes. Very calm. Here's what I think happened. Here's what you misunderstood. Here's why you're not seeing this clearly. Always in that order. She set the phone down. I used to think it was communication. It took me years to realize it was just winning on paper, so there was no record of losing. Thomas looked up from his phone. What did you do with the notes? I kept them, she said. For a long time. I thought they were proof that he was trying, that he cared enough to put it in writing. She stopped. I threw them all out the day I left. Good, Thomas said simply. Her phone buzzed. A text this time. Unknown number, but the cadence of it, the particular rhythm of the sentences was immediately recognizable. Margaret, I'm not here to fight. I'm worried about you. You left so suddenly and you won't answer, and I just need to know you're safe. That's all. I'm not angry. I love you. Please come down. She read it once. She put the phone face down. He says he's not angry, she said. He came to your building unannounced at dinner time, Thomas said. He's angry. He doesn't think he is. That's the thing. She pressed her fingers against the back of the phone like she was keeping it flat. He genuinely believes he's being reasonable. He's always believed that. In his version of our marriage, he was always the reasonable one. What were you in his version? She almost smiled, but it had no humor in it. The one who needed managing. Thomas stood up. He moved to the kitchen, refilled both their cups without asking, and brought hers back. He set it in front of her and sat back down across the table. What would you have done, he said 6 months ago, if he'd shown up somewhere like this? She knew the answer. She didn't want to say it. Gone down, she said. Listened. Apologized for worrying him. Come home. But you're not doing that. No. What's different? She looked at the picture frame on the side table. The laughing woman in the yellow cardigan kneeling beside a little girl with a drawing and a face full of uncomplicated joy. I remembered, she said, what my own voice sounds like. The front desk called again at the 52-minute mark. He's gone, Ms. Reed. Just walked out. Thank you, Margaret said. She hung up and sat with the information for a moment. Not relief exactly, more like the particular stillness after a storm passes when the air is different, but you're still waiting to be sure it's over. He'll be back, she said. Probably. Thomas agreed. That doesn't scare me as much as it used to, she said slowly, as if she was discovering this fact at the same moment she was saying it. I don't know if that's growth or just adrenaline. Could be both, Thomas said. Growth often feels like adrenaline until it doesn't have to anymore. She looked at him. Do you always talk like that? Like what? Like someone who's actually thought about things. Thomas considered this with apparent seriousness. My daughter says I talk like a fortune cookie that went to business school. Margaret laughed. This time it was longer, fuller, the kind that actually reached her eyes. I'd like to meet your daughter, she said, and then caught herself. The laugh fading at the edges as she realized what she'd said and what it implied. Thomas didn't make it strange. She'd like you, he said. She has strong opinions about people who stood in front of children for 26 years. Strong positive or strong negative? Positive. Her third-grade teacher is the reason she became an engineer. A pause. She'll tell you it was the math, but it was the teacher. Margaret was quiet for a moment. I've thought about that sometimes, the ones I had, whether they know. They don't, Thomas said, but they carry it anyway. She picked up her coffee. The apartment was quiet around them, a comfortable quiet, which still surprised her every time she noticed it. She was not used to quiet being comfortable. In her marriage, quiet had always meant something was being calculated. Then, her phone lit up again. Not the front desk, not Derek. Lily. She answered. Mom. Lily's voice was different this time, lower, careful. Dad called me after he left your building. I know he was there. Mom, he's really not okay. A breath. He was crying. Margaret closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Lily. I know what you're going to say. He cried at our first counseling session too, Margaret said. And then in the car afterward he told me I'd embarrassed him in front of a stranger. He has never once cried without it being strategic. I'm not saying he doesn't feel things. I'm saying his feelings have always been load-bearing. They hold something up for him. Silence from Lily. That's, Lily said slowly, a really specific thing to say. I've had a lot of time to think. Are you who's there with you? Is someone there? My neighbor, Margaret said. Thomas. The coffee guy. The coffee guy. A pause. Is he... Is this Mom, are you? Lily. Margaret's voice was warm but firm. I am 61 years old. I am allowed to have dinner with a neighbor. I know I'm sorry. Lily exhaled. I've never heard you sound like this. Like what? Like yourself, Lily said quietly. Like actually yourself. Margaret's throat tightened. I'll call you tomorrow, she managed. Earlier this time. Okay. Mom, I love you. I love you too, baby. She hung up. She sat very still. Thomas did not ask what Lily had said. He had heard most of it. He understood that she needed a moment to let it land without having to explain it. She said, Margaret told him anyway that I sound like myself. You do, Thomas said. I didn't realize how long I hadn't, she said. That's the part that gets me. Not what I lost. How long I didn't notice I was losing it. The clock on the kitchen wall moved. Outside, the city went on being a city. Inside apartment 4, B2 people sat across a kitchen table in the kind of silence that isn't emptiness, but its opposite, full of everything that's been said and everything that doesn't need to be. Thomas left at 8:30. He said goodnight at her door, simply without ceremony. He did not suggest tomorrow. He did not create an obligation or an expectation. He just said, "Good night, Margaret," the way a person says something they mean exactly, and nothing more. She closed the door. She stood in her apartment alone. She made a cup of tea, the way she actually liked it strong, no sugar with a small amount of honey that Derek had always called excessive, and she sat in her chair and she read 40 pages of Charlotte's Web out loud to no one doing all the voices, and she did not apologize to anyone for any of it. The building meeting was Mrs. Brooks' idea. It happened 3 days later in the second-floor common room that smelled like old carpet and occasionally someone's experimental cooking. The leak from Margaret's apartment had, it turned out, done secondary damage to the hallway ceiling on the 3rd floor and to the corner of Mrs. Brooks's sitting room below, and Mrs. Brooks had decided this warranted collective discussion with the building management, which she had communicated to the management company in a letter of such precise and documented fury that they had agreed to a meeting within 24 hours. I've been in this building 37 years, Mrs. Brooks told Margaret on the way downstairs. They know when I write a letter it's a warning shot. What's the actual shot? Margaret asked. I have a nephew who's a housing attorney, Mrs. Brooks said pleasantly. I've never had to use him. I find the threat sufficient. Thomas was already in the common room when they arrived, standing near the back with a cup of coffee from his own apartment, because, as he told Margaret quietly, the building's communal coffee is a war crime, and I won't participate. 4 other residents had come. Margaret didn't know them yet, but recognized them by their faces, the particular expression of people who had complaints they'd been sitting on and had finally been given a container. The building manager, a man named Garrett, who had the energy of someone who had chosen this job because he'd believed it would be calm, stood at the front with a clipboard and the expression of someone who now understood he had been wrong. It started normally. Water damage insurance claims repair timelines. Garrett used words like going forward and our process and understandable concerns in the way that people use phrases when they want to fill air without making promises. Mrs. Brooks dismantled each one methodically. Margaret watched her and thought that is a woman who was told her whole life to be reasonable, and decided at some point that reasonable was overrated. She was taking notes on her phone, dates, figures. Garrett's exact language, because 26 years in a classroom had made documentation instinctive, and because Thomas had told her yesterday that documentation was how you made sure things actually happened. She was mid-note when she heard the common room door open behind her. She heard it, and her spine knew before she turned around. Derek Foster walked in like he belonged there. He was wearing the charcoal jacket she'd bought him for their 28th anniversary. He'd had his hair cut. He looked calm and concerned and reasonable, the precise presentation of a man who had spent the drive over deciding exactly what impression he needed to make. "Sorry I'm late," he said to the room at large with a small, self-deprecating smile. "I got the notice on the door. Margaret mentioned this building had some maintenance issues." He had not gotten any notice. Margaret had not mentioned anything to him. He had come because he had driven past until he'd found her name in the building directory, which she had not thought to have removed yet, and he had walked in because the door was propped open and no one had stopped him. And Derek Foster had never needed an invitation because the space between no one stopped me and I was welcome had always been in his mind barely a distance at all. She did not say any of this. She looked at him across the room, and something in her chest went very cold and very quiet, the way things do when you have been afraid of a moment for a long time, and then the moment arrives, and you discover you are not in fact as afraid as you thought. "Derek," she said, "this is a residence meeting." "I know. I just wanted to—" "You're not a resident," she said. A small pause. He smiled the gentle, patient smile of a man who is being very calm about someone else's unreasonableness. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay. After the other night." "I'm fine," Margaret said. "You've seemed overwhelmed. The move, the leak, all of it." He turned slightly toward the room, addressing the group as if they were witnesses he was collecting. "She gets like this sometimes. Takes on too much. I just worry." The room shifted. Margaret felt it, that subtle social realignment when someone reframes the story and everyone recalibrates. "She gets like this. I just worry." 6 words that painted her as a pattern and him as a caretaker. She had watched him do this for 31 years. She had watched him do it so smoothly that she had never been able to point at. It had never been able to say that thing you just did, because by the time she'd found the words, he'd already moved on, and she was already defending herself against an accusation that had never been technically stated. Garrett was nodding vaguely. 2 of the residents had rearranged their faces into sympathy. Mrs. Brooks had not moved. Her expression had gone from sharp to surgical. Thomas in the back had gone very still. "She gets like this," Mrs. Brooks said. Her voice was pleasant and precise and about 10 degrees colder than it had been 30 seconds ago. "What does that mean exactly?" Derek turned to her. He recalibrated older woman authority in her posture potential ally. "Margaret sometimes struggles with change. I'm not criticizing. I love her. I've always supported." "What is your name?" Mrs. Brooks said. "Derek Foster." "Are you a resident of this building, Mr. Foster?" "No, but—" "Then this meeting doesn't involve you." Mrs. Brooks turned back to Garrett. "Now, the water damage to my sitting room. I have photographs dated—" "Margaret." Derek's voice dropped. Lower now, more private. He stepped toward her, and the step was practiced, not large enough to be threatening, just close enough to make the conversation feel personal, to make the room disappear, to make it about the 2 of them, the way he always made everything about the 2 of them. "Can we just talk 5 minutes? That's all I'm asking." And Margaret felt it, the pull of it. 31 years of 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes, that's reasonable, isn't it? 31 years of 5 minutes that turned into an hour. That turned into a concession. That turned into going home. That turned into never leaving. She looked at him. She thought about a parking lot, a car, the inability to go back inside her own house. She thought about Charlotte's Web read aloud to no one. All the voices, no apologies. "No," she said. Derek blinked. "Margaret." "No," she said again. And her voice was not shaking. That surprised her, that her voice was not shaking. "I don't owe you 5 minutes. I don't owe you a conversation. I left. That was my answer. Showing up here doesn't change my answer. It just tells me I was right to give it." The room was very quiet. Derek's face did something complicated. The patience thinned. The smile became something adjacent to a smile that was not quite a smile. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said quietly, "in front of people you don't even know yet." And there it was. The thing underneath. Always eventually the thing underneath. "She knows me," Mrs. Brooks said without looking up from her notes. 3 days, and I know her better than you apparently did in 31 years. Sit down or leave, Mr. Foster. Either way, stop talking." Someone in the room made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Thomas had not moved from the back of the room. He had not stepped forward. He had not spoken. Margaret had felt him there the whole time, steady present, not in front of her. And she understood that this was deliberate, that he had decided his place in this moment. And it was beside her, not in front of her, and that distinction was everything. Derek looked at Thomas. He had clearly been aware of him the whole time, the way people are aware of a thing they're pretending not to see. "Is this him?" he said to Margaret. "This is the neighbor." "That's not your business," Margaret said. "You've known him for 3 days, and you're letting him—" "He's not letting me do anything," Margaret said. "I'm doing it." Derek turned to Thomas directly. "Do you even know what you're getting into?" Thomas looked at him for a moment. The look of a man who has run enough meetings to know when someone is performing for an audience and when they're genuinely asking something. "I know enough," he said. "I know she doesn't belong to you." The word landed. Belong. Derek went very still. Margaret stepped forward. She had been trembling somewhere deep in her chest since the moment she'd heard the door open, some old wire still firing the old signals. But her feet moved and her voice was level, and she said, "I didn't leave because I was confused. I didn't leave because I was overwhelmed or struggling or going through something. I left because I spent 31 years making myself smaller to fit in a space you decided was the right size for me." She paused. "I'm not angry at you, Derek. I want you to hear that. I'm not angry. I'm just not coming back. And no amount of showing up is going to change that, because what I'm going back to isn't you. It's myself." The room was absolutely still. Derek opened his mouth. Mrs. Brooks said without any particular emphasis, "Mr. Foster, the door is behind you." He looked at the room. He did the calculation, the one Margaret had watched him do 100 times, the assessment of what was winnable and what wasn't, of what retreat could be framed as strategy. He looked at Margaret one more time. His face did something she'd never quite seen on it before. Not anger, not patience. Something underneath both of those. Something that looked almost like grief, which she believed was real, and which she also understood was not her responsibility to absorb. He left. The door closed behind him. No one in the room spoke for 3 full seconds. Then Garrett said with the tone of a man trying to recover professional ground, "So, the 3rd floor hallway ceiling." "Yes," said Mrs. Brooks crisply. "Let's get back to that." Margaret sat down. Her knees were shaking. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. Slow, even the breath of someone reminding themselves that they are standing on solid ground. She felt a hand settle briefly on her shoulder. Light, momentary. There and then gone. Thomas sitting down beside her. Not in front of her. Beside. She did not look at him. She didn't need to. She picked up her phone, found her notes, and went back to documenting what Garrett was saying about the repair timeline, because that was what she had come here to do, and she was going to do it. Mrs. Brooks was watching her from across the table, with an expression that was not pity or admiration exactly, but something that held both of those things inside something larger. The recognition of one woman who had done a hard thing in the face of another woman who had just done the same. She gave Margaret one small nod. Margaret gave it back. Outside in the lobby, the elevator went down. And somewhere on Clement Street, a car that had been parked too long finally pulled away from the curb, and the space it left behind was for once a relief rather than a loss. She cried in the elevator, not during, not in front of anyone. She held it together through the rest of the building meeting, through Garrett's repair commitments and Mrs. Brooks's final cross-examination, and the small, awkward moment when 2 of the other residents touched her arm on the way out and said nothing, which was exactly right. She held it through the hallway, and through finding her key, and through getting the door open. Then she got in the elevator to go back upstairs, and the doors closed, and she put her back against the wall and her hand over her mouth, and she let it come. Not because she regretted it. That was the thing she needed to understand about these tears. Even as they were happening, they were not regret. They were not grief for Derek, or for the marriage, or for the 31 years. They were the specific physical release of someone who has been braced for impact for so long that when the impact finally comes and they survive it, the body doesn't know what to do with the tension it no longer needs. She had stood up in a room full of strangers and told the truth, out loud, without apologizing, without softening it, without waiting to see if he'd let her finish. The elevator opened on the 4th floor. Thomas was standing in the hallway. He had taken the stairs. She looked at him. Her eyes were wet and her face was not composed, and she didn't try to make it composed. She just looked at him. "I did it," she said. "I know," he said. "I was there. I'm crying. I can see that." "I'm not sad," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way that would have sounded like a contradiction to anyone who didn't understand what it meant to cry from relief. Thomas understood. "I know," he said. "Come on." He didn't touch her. He didn't steer her or guide her. He just walked toward her apartment, and she followed, and he stood beside her while she got the door open, and they went inside, and she sat on her couch, and he went to her kitchen, and came back with a glass of water, and set it on the table in front of her. He sat in the chair across from her. He waited. She drank the water. She breathed. She let her hands stop shaking on their own timeline without apologizing for how long it took. "He said I was embarrassing myself," she said finally. "I heard." For a second, I believed him. She looked at her hands. "That's the thing I can't quite even now, even after everything there was. 1 second where I thought, what if he's right? What if I'm making this into something it isn't? What if I'm the problem?" She looked up. 1 second. After 3 weeks and a parking lot and a cracked ceiling and all of it. 1 second and he almost had me. "But he didn't," Thomas said. "But he didn't," she agreed. "That 1 second gets shorter," Thomas said. "Every time. Until one day it's not there at all." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" He was quiet for a moment. "After Sarah died, I went back to work in 11 days. 11 days. My daughter was furious. My board was relieved. I told myself I was fine, that working was how I processed, that Sarah would have understood, that grief didn't have to look like stopping." He paused. "For about 8 months, I believed that completely. Then one morning, I was in a meeting and someone laughed at something, a stupid thing, someone's bad joke, and I thought Sarah would have hated that joke, and I had to leave the room." Margaret was very still. "I sat in the hallway outside my own boardroom for 20 minutes, Thomas said. And the whole time there was this voice telling me I was being ridiculous, that it had been 8 months that I was a 55-year-old man sitting on the floor outside a meeting. That voice was very convincing." He met her eyes. "But I was still on the floor, because some things are true, even when the voice telling you they're not is very persuasive." "Did you go back in?" Margaret asked. "Eventually." A pause. "I also cried on the floor first, which I have told approximately no one." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me?" He considered it. "Because you just stood up in front of 8 strangers and told the truth about 31 years of your life. The least I can do is be honest about a hallway floor." Something broke open quietly in Margaret's chest. Not painfully, the way ice breaks in spring, not a catastrophe, just a giving way to something that was always going to happen, that was always underneath, waiting for enough warmth. "Thomas," she said. "I don't know what this is." She said it carefully, meaning it carefully, not a deflection, not an avoidance, just the precise truth. "I don't know what we are. I'm not sure I'm ready to know yet." "Okay," he said. "That's it, just okay?" "What else would I say?" She stared at him. Most people would push, or pull back entirely, or need a definition. "I'm not most people," Thomas said. "And I'm not 23. I don't need a label tonight." He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "I'd like to have dinner with you on Friday. A real one. Not emergency sandwiches." She almost smiled. "Is that a date?" "It's dinner," he said. "Whatever you need it to be." She looked at him for a long moment. "Friday," she said. "Yes." Why? The next morning she called the school district. Not to ask questions this time, to start the process. She used the number they'd given her, spoke to a woman named Patricia, who had the warm, efficient energy of someone who genuinely loved her job, and learned that her 26 years of experience put her on an accelerated reinstatement track. 6 months some coursework, a classroom observation period. Patricia said, "Between you and me, we fight over teachers with your experience level." Margaret hung up and stood in her kitchen for a full minute. Then she called Lily. "I'm going back to teaching," she said before Lily could say hello. A beat. "Mom?" 6 months to reinstatement. I called this morning. "Mom." Lily's voice did something complicated, joy and grief, and something that sounded like a long exhale of relief. "You loved that job." "I did," Margaret said. "I let someone convince me I'd outgrown it. I hadn't." "You really hadn't." A pause. "Dad called me again last night." Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. "What did he say?" "He said you embarrassed him in front of your neighbors, and that you're not thinking clearly, and that he thinks you're having a—" Lily stopped. "He used the word breakdown again." "And what do you think?" Margaret asked. A long pause. "I think," Lily said slowly, "that you sound more like yourself than you have in years. And I think I've been so worried about both of you being okay that I've been letting him tell me what okay looks like for you." Another pause, harder. "I'm sorry, Mom. I saw things. For a long time. I told myself it wasn't my place." "It's not your fault, Lily." "I know. But I'm sorry anyway." They talked for 40 minutes longer than they'd talked in years. A real conversation, not a check-in, not a managed update. Lily asked about the reinstatement process. She asked about Mrs. Brooks. She asked about Thomas with a careful, neutral curiosity that Margaret recognized as her daughter trying very hard not to be obvious about what she actually wanted to know. "He's a good man," Margaret said finally, answering the question Lily hadn't quite asked. "Good how?" "He doesn't tell me what to do. He makes sure I've eaten. He takes the stairs when I need the elevator to myself." She paused. "He cried on a hallway floor once and told me about it." Lily was quiet. Then, "That last one is significant." "I know," Margaret said. After she hung up, she went to Thomas's door and knocked. When he answered, she held up the piece of paper with the school district information on it. "I started the process," she said. He looked at the paper, then at her. "Congratulations. Don't make it a big thing." "I'm not." "You're making a face." "I'm not making any face." "You're making the proud face." Thomas said very seriously. "I don't have a proud face." "You absolutely have a proud face, and you're doing it right now," Margaret said, and she was laughing before she'd finished the sentence, and he was trying not to, and failing, and it was the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself as important, but is. Friday dinner was at a restaurant 3 blocks away that Thomas had been to twice, and Margaret had walked past 6 times since moving in. They sat at a table by the window. They ordered without rushing. They talked about things that weren't the building weren't. Derek weren't grief or fear or survival. They talked about her students, the ones she still thought about, the ones who had written her letters years later. They talked about his company, the projects that had mattered to him, the ones that had just been work. He talked about Sarah in a way he clearly hadn't done with many people, not performing grief, just including her in the conversation. The way you include someone who was real. Margaret talked about who she'd been at 35, at 40, at 50. The incremental disappearance of herself. The way it had happened so gradually, she'd thought that was just what getting older felt like, the narrowing, the quiet. "When did you know something was wrong?" Thomas asked. "Honestly." She looked at her glass. "When my students started drawing pictures of me, and I didn't recognize myself in them." She looked up. "Kids draw what they see. What they drew was a woman who smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. I was 39. I thought I was just tired." Thomas was quiet. "When did you know something was wrong?" she asked. "After Sarah." "When I renovated the apartment," he said. 2 months after the funeral. Gutted the whole thing. Knew everything. Told myself it was practical fresh start, Update the space. He paused. My daughter came to see it and walked around very quietly and then said, "Dad, you took out everything that looked like her." And I said, "I know." A long pause. I don't know if I was trying to stop missing her or start. I still don't know. Maybe both, Margaret said. Maybe both, he agreed. They walked home slowly, side by side, their pace matched without discussion. At the building door, he held it open. In the elevator, she pressed 4. He pressed 4. They both noticed that neither of them had pressed a different floor. At her door, she turned. "Thank you," she said. "For dinner." "Thank you for going," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The hallway was quiet around them. The moment had the particular quality of something that could go several directions and was waiting for information. "I panicked this afternoon," she said suddenly. He waited. "Before I got ready, I put on the dress I'd bought and I looked in the mirror and I thought, what if I'm just replacing one thing with another? What if I'm not ready and I'm too desperate to see it and I'm going to—" "Margaret." "I sat on my bed for 20 minutes, she said, talking myself into and out of going. "But you went," he said. "But I went. What made you—" She thought about it. "I decided I was allowed to want something even if I wasn't completely sure yet." Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, that. "It terrifies me," she said. "You terrify me. Not you specifically. The idea of trusting the feeling." "I know," he said. "I'm terrified too." She looked at him sharply. "You don't seem terrified." "I'm extremely good at seeming calm," Thomas said. "It's the most transferable skill I have." He paused. "I haven't wanted to have dinner with anyone in 3 years. Tonight I checked the reservation twice and changed my jacket 4 times. She stared at him. 4 times. The 4th one was the second one. I went back to it. She laughed. He let himself smile, a real one, the kind that changed his whole face. "Good night, Margaret," he said. "Good night, Thomas," she said. She went inside. She leaned against the closed door and pressed her hands to her face and breathed. She was not replacing one thing with another. She knew the difference, had learned it the hard way, the slow way, the 31-year way. She knew what it felt like to be managed and called loved. She knew what it felt like to apologize for taking up space. This felt like neither of those things. This felt like being seen by someone who wasn't trying to do anything with what they saw. 3 weeks after Friday dinner, a woman named Carol, a mutual acquaintance of Derek's and Margaret's from their old neighborhood, called Margaret's cell phone. Margaret almost didn't answer. The number was familiar in that peripheral way, the way numbers are familiar when you know the person without knowing them well. She answered. "Margaret, I hope this isn't— I wanted to reach out because Derek asked me to." Carol's voice had the careful energy of someone who has been recruited for something they're not entirely comfortable with. "He wanted me to tell you he's been doing some reflecting, that he misses you, that he thinks if you could just talk, really talk without—" "Carol," Margaret said. "I appreciate that you called. I know this was probably awkward to be asked." "It was a little," Carol admitted. "I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Not for Derek, for yourself." A pause. "Did you ever watch us together and think something was off?" Silence. "Carol." A long pause. "Yes," Carol said quietly. "Yes, I did. I told myself it was just how some couples are. It was how we were," Margaret said. "And I'm not angry at you for not saying anything. I'm not angry at anyone. But I need you to understand that this isn't a rough patch. This isn't me being overwhelmed or confused or needing to talk it through. I left because I finally understood what I'd been living in." She paused. "Please tell Derek I wish him well. And please don't call me on his behalf again." "Okay," Carol said. "Margaret, for what it's worth, you sound really good." "I am," Margaret said. "I really am." She hung up. She sat with it for a moment, the last thread, the last attempted reach-through, and her voice on it, clear and unhurried and unafraid. Then she picked up her phone and blocked Derek's number. No drama. No announcement. No moment of ceremony. She just pressed the button and put the phone in her pocket. She went to Thomas's door and knocked. He answered in about 4 seconds, which told her he'd been awake, probably working. He looked at her face and read it the way he'd learned to read it, not for damage, just for information. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I just blocked his number." Thomas looked at her. "I wanted to tell someone," she said. "I didn't want to do it alone and not tell anyone." "Good," he said. "Do you want coffee?" "God, yes," she said. She stepped inside. The apartment that had been a stranger's 3 weeks ago felt like a known place. Now the particular geography of someone else's life that you learn slowly, the way the light falls, the way he takes his coffee, the way he goes quiet when he's thinking, versus when he's simply at rest. They sat at the kitchen table with their cups. "She said I sound good," Margaret said. The woman who called, Carol. "Do you feel good?" She thought about it honestly. "I feel real," she said. "I feel like I'm actually inside my own life instead of watching it from somewhere nearby." She looked at him. "Is that a strange thing to say?" "No," Thomas said. "That's the only thing worth feeling." She looked at him across the table. This man who had opened a door at 2 a.m. and made coffee and taken the stairs and changed his jacket 4 times and told her about a hallway floor. This man who had sat beside her, never in front of her, who had advised without instructing, who had stayed inside moments instead of rushing through them. "I don't need you to save me," she said. It was not a warning. It was not a wall. It was a fact offered clearly the way she was learning to offer facts. "I need you to believe me while I save myself." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "I already do," he said. "I have since the sandwich." She laughed, that full laugh, the one that reached her eyes and stayed there. "The sandwich," she said. "You ate it," he said. "While he was in the lobby. You didn't let him ruin dinner. I thought—" He stopped, picked back up. "I thought there she is. That's who she is." Margaret sat with that. Let it land all the way. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in the evening, settling into itself, the particular frequency of a place that never fully stops but does for a few hours, slow down enough to breathe. Inside apartment 4A on Clement Street, 2 people sat across a kitchen table with cups of coffee. They were actually drinking, talking about nothing urgent and everything real. No one was monitoring the other's cup. No one was keeping score. No one was apologizing for how they took their coffee. It was, Margaret thought, almost boring. It was the best thing she'd had in 31 years. The first day, Margaret walked back into a classroom. She stood at the door for 45 seconds before she went in. She counted them. Not because she was afraid, or not only because she was afraid, but because she wanted to remember this exact moment. The weight of a canvas bag on her shoulder with Charlotte's Web inside it. The sound of 22 third graders on the other side of a door that hadn't opened yet. The fact that she was 61 years old and starting over, and her hands were shaking, and she was doing it anyway. She had called Thomas that morning at 6:45. "I don't know why I'm calling," she said. "You're probably in a meeting." "I'm in my kitchen," he said. "How are your hands?" "Shaking," she said. "How did you know about my hands?" "Because that's how you are when something matters," he said. "Go in, Margaret. I haven't even told you what—" "You're standing outside the classroom door," he said. "Go in." She had stared at her phone for a moment. "You're very annoying," she said. "I know," he said. "Call me after." She went in. By 10:30, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, with 22 8-year-olds in a circle around her reading aloud, doing all the voices. Wilbur nervous and hopeful. Charlotte knowing more than she said, but saying exactly the right amount. The children were silent, in the particular way children go silent, when a story has them completely, not the silence of boredom or compliance, but the held-breath silence of a person who has been pulled into something real and doesn't want to break the surface. When she got to the end of the chapter and looked up a girl in the front, small, serious-faced with braids and a gap where her front tooth had been, said, "You're the best reader I ever heard." Margaret's throat closed. "Thank you," she said when she could. "That means a great deal to me." She called Thomas on her lunch break. He picked up on the first ring. "A little girl told me I was the best reader she'd ever heard," Margaret said. Her voice was unsteady, and she didn't try to steady it. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Of course she did," he said. "I cried in the supply closet afterward." "Also correct," he said. She laughed and pressed her hand to her eyes and stood in the hallway of an elementary school at 61 years old, feeling more like herself than she had at 50 or 45 or 40. Feeling specifically like the woman in the yellow cardigan kneeling beside a little girl with a drawing. Not a memory of that woman, not a reconstruction of her, but the actual continuing present-tense version of her who had always been there underneath everything and was finally, definitively back. "Thank you," she said to Thomas, "for that first morning, the coffee." "It was just coffee," he said. "No," she said. "It wasn't." He didn't argue with that. Da hike. 6 months moved the way time moves when you are actually living inside it, rather than waiting for it to pass quickly in retrospect, full in the present. Margaret completed her reinstatement coursework on Tuesday nights and Saturday mornings. She went back to Mrs. Patterson's third-grade class as a permanent hire in the spring. She and Mrs. Brooks had dinner every other Thursday, a tradition that had started accidentally when they'd both been in the hallway at the same time with takeout bags, and had looked at each other and arrived at an obvious conclusion. She and Thomas had a fight in month 4, a real one. Not a disagreement handled carefully from a distance, but an actual fight, the kind that comes from two people who are close enough to hit the real things. It started small. Thomas had called the school district on her behalf, not about anything significant, just to ask about the parking situation near the school, because she'd mentioned it was difficult and he'd known someone on the facilities board and had made a call. When Margaret found out, she went very still, in the way she went still when something hit a nerve that ran deeper than the surface issue. "You called them," she said, "without telling me." "It was about parking," Thomas said. "It was a 30-second call." "That's not the point." "Then what's the point?" "The point," Margaret said, and her voice was controlled in the way that it got controlled when she was genuinely angry, rather than just upset, "is that I spent 31 years with a man who was always doing things on my behalf without asking me first, and who always had a very reasonable explanation for why it wasn't a big deal, and it was always never a big deal, until one day I looked up, and my entire life had been managed into a shape I didn't recognize." Thomas went quiet. "I am not Derek," he said, and his voice had an edge to it, not defensive exactly, but firm, the voice of a man who will not accept an unfair comparison without saying so. "I know that," Margaret said. "I know you're not Derek, and I also know that what you did came from a good place, and I also know that it still felt like someone reaching into my life and moving things without checking with me first. Both of those things are true at the same time." The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas sat down. He pressed his hands flat on the table, the gesture she recognized had seen him use in the building meeting when he was thinking carefully before speaking. "You're right," he said. "I should have asked." She blinked. "That's it." "What else would I say?" "Most people would defend themselves longer." "I did it without asking you first," Thomas said. "That was wrong. I was trying to help, and I didn't check if help was what you wanted or what form you needed it in." He looked at her. "I'm sorry." She stood across the kitchen from him and felt something move through her that she didn't have a precise word for, not relief, exactly, not surprise exactly, but something that lived between those two things. The experience of a person who has braced for impact so many times that when the impact doesn't come, the body needs a moment to understand that. "In my marriage," she said slowly, "I'm sorry was always followed by but." "I know," Thomas said. "There's no but." She sat down across from him. They looked at each other across the table. "I'm going to do that again," he said. "Not the specific thing, but something like it. I'm going to move too fast or assume or try to fix something before you've asked me to. I'm built that way. I've been running a company for 30 years, and my instinct is always solve it." "I know," Margaret said. "And when I do, I need you to tell me," he said. "Like this. Exactly like this. Even if it turns into a fight. Especially then," Thomas said. "A fight I can see is better than a silence I can't." She looked at him for a long moment. "Derek never said that," she said quietly. "Not a comparison, a recognition. A data point in the ongoing project of understanding what different actually felt like. I'm not—" "I know you're not," she said. "That's why I'm still sitting here." They ordered takeout that night. They ate at his kitchen table and talked about other things, her students, his quarterly numbers, a book. Mrs. Brooks had recommended to both of them independently without telling either of them. She'd recommended it to the other. The fight was over. Not papered over, not managed into silence. Over, resolved, finished. The way things can be finished when both people in a room are actually trying. Margaret thought so. This is what it's supposed to feel like. She filed it carefully. The way she filed the morning with the little girl, and the supply closet, and the voices she'd done for 22 children who had gone very still. Evidence. Proof. The accumulating record of a life being rebuilt from the inside out. Bulk. The twist came in month 8, and it came from a direction Margaret had not anticipated. Lily called on a Tuesday morning, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the silence on the other end. Before she spoke, the particular weighted silence of someone who has been sitting with information and has decided the time has come to give it. "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not. I need you to hear the whole thing before you react." Margaret set down her coffee. "Okay. He's been talking to people. People from your old neighborhood. People you used to work with years ago before you stopped." A breath. "He's been telling them a version of what happened. That you had a breakdown. That you got involved with someone right away, and it affected your judgment. That he's worried about you." Margaret was very still. "He told the Harmons," Lily said. "And Patricia Chen, do you remember her? From the school board years ago? He told her specifically that you'd had some kind of episode and that she should be careful about the reinstatement." The word landed like something physical. "The reinstatement," Margaret said. "He knows someone who knows someone on the district committee. I don't know if he actually did anything or if he just talked. But Mom, I think he was trying to take the school," Margaret said. Her voice was completely flat. Not angry, yet past angry, into the clear, cold territory that comes after anger has burned through and left only understanding. That's the one thing I'd taken back that he could still reach. "Mom. How do you know this?" "His sister called me," Lily said quietly. "Aunt Renee. She said she'd heard him on the phone and she didn't. She said she couldn't stay quiet about it. She said she was ashamed." Margaret pressed her free hand flat on the kitchen counter. "Did he succeed?" she asked. "Has anyone from the district said anything?" "Not yet. I don't know if he actually made a call or just talked. But Mom, I think you should. I think you need to know." "I know," Margaret said. "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for calling." She hung up. She stood in her kitchen. She thought about Patricia from the school district. "We fight over teachers with your experience level." She thought about her students. The girl with the braids and the gap tooth, and the declaration about reading. She thought about 22 children who had sat in a circle and gone quiet and trusted her completely. She picked up her phone. She did not call Thomas first. That was a decision she made consciously, deliberately. The decision of a woman who knew the difference between wanting support and needing rescue. She called Patricia at the school district directly. "Patricia, this is Margaret Reed. I need to speak with you about something. I've been made aware that my ex-husband may have made contact with someone at the district level with some inaccurate information about my circumstances. I want to address it directly rather than wait to find out if it becomes a problem." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then, "Margaret, I appreciate you calling, and I'm going to tell you yes. We received a call from someone claiming to be concerned about your mental fitness." Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. "And," she said, and Patricia said, I pulled your observation reports. I pulled your students' assessments. I spoke to your supervising teacher. I was going to call you this week." A pause. "Margaret, your classroom is one of the strongest we have right now. Whatever that call was, it doesn't match a single thing I've seen from you." The breath Margaret took was slow and deep and entirely involuntary. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. You built that," Patricia said. "He can make a call. He can't make a call that changes what your students experience every day. That's yours." She hung up. She sat down on her kitchen floor. Not in distress. Not in collapse. She sat down because her legs decided they were done standing for a moment, and she let them. And she sat there on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, and she thought about Derek making a phone call to take the last thing she'd reclaimed. She thought about him sitting somewhere believing he was protecting her. That version of events always available to him. The story where he was reasonable and she was confused. She thought he did not succeed. She thought, "I built that. He cannot take what I built." She was still sitting on the floor when her phone rang. "Thomas." She answered. "Hey." "You've been quiet for 40 minutes, he said. "Old floors." She almost laughed. "I'm on the kitchen floor." A beat. "Do you need me to come over?" "No," she said. "I'm okay. I just needed a minute." "What happened?" She told him. All of it. Lily's call, Renee's information. What Derek had tried to do. Patricia's response. She told it clearly and in order, the way she'd learned to tell things when she no longer needed to manage how they landed. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence on his end lasted about 4 seconds. "He called the school district," Thomas said. "He did. And it didn't work." "It didn't work." Another pause. "Are you angry?" "Yes," she said. I'm sitting on my kitchen floor, and I'm okay. Both things." "Do you want me to do anything?" "No," she said. "I handled it." "I know," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She pressed her head back against the cabinet. "Come over later. Bring that terrible wine you think is good." "It's an excellent wine," Thomas said with great dignity. "It's not," Margaret said. "Come anyway." He came. They drank the wine, which was Margaret maintained objectively mediocre, and she told him the whole thing again, in the telling it for real way, the way you tell something the second time, when the first time was still inside the shock of it. He listened the same way he'd listened the first time, fully, without rushing to the end, without offering solutions she hadn't asked for. "He's going to try again," Margaret said. "Something, sometime. That's just who he is." "Probably," Thomas said. "I'm not afraid of it," she said. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. I'm angry. I'm not afraid." "That's not a small thing," Thomas said. "No," she said. "It's not." 1 year after a woman had knocked on the wrong door at 2 a.m. with a cracked picture frame and soaking wet shoes. It rained again on Clement Street, not the desperate rain of that first night, a softer rain, the kind that makes a city look clean. Margaret stood at her window and listened to it and thought about a year. What a year looks like when you're actually the one building it. She had a classroom. She had her students. She had Mrs. Brooks on alternating Thursdays with the too strong coffee and the piano that was still being played badly and with complete commitment. She had Lily, who had started calling 3 times a week and had come to visit in February, had met Thomas over dinner, had shaken his hand, and then hugged him, which she reported to Margaret afterward with the tone of someone who'd surprised themselves. She had herself. That was the one that still caught her sometimes, the simple radical fact of being entirely, recognizably herself. She picked up the box from the corner of her bedroom. She had packed it carefully, not frantically, not with the urgency of escape, but with the deliberate pleasure of someone who is moving toward something rather than away. Her lease was ending. She had options. She had looked at 2 other apartments, had considered staying in 4B, had considered a lot of things with the unhurried certainty of a woman who knew that her choices were hers. She had made her choice. She knocked on 4A's door. Thomas opened it in about 3 seconds, which meant he'd heard her in the hallway and had not pretended he hadn't. He looked at her. He looked at the box. He read the label on the side written in her neat teacher's handwriting. Kitchen/definitely not running away. Something moved across his face, complicated and quiet, and completely unguarded the expression of a man who has kept himself behind glass for 3 years and has gradually over the course of 12 months and a lot of coffee and one argument and a hallway floor and a terrible wine let someone stand on the same side of it as him. "Your lease," he said, "ended yesterday," Margaret said. "You could have renewed it." "I could have," she agreed. "I looked at 2 other places. Nice apartments, one had better light. And I kept thinking about old floors," she said, "and a man who takes the stairs when I need the elevator to myself." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "Margaret," he said, "is there room?" She lifted the box slightly. "In your life. For someone who comes with her own books and strong opinions about coffee and a classroom of 22 kids she talks about constantly and—" "Yes," Thomas said. Not quickly, not impulsively. With the weight of a man who has considered this, who has known for some time what his answer was, and is saying it now because the moment has finally matched the truth he's been holding. "I have a lot of books," Margaret said. "I have a lot of shelves," Thomas said. "They've always felt like too many for one person." She looked at him. "I need you to know I'm not moving in because I need somewhere to go. I have somewhere to go. I'm moving in because I want to be here. That's a different thing." "I know the difference," Thomas said. "I've known it since the sandwich." She laughed that full laugh entirely herself, the one that had come back incrementally over 12 months until it was just hers again, automatic and unguarded. "The sandwich," she said. "You ate it while he was in the lobby," Thomas said. "You didn't let him ruin dinner. I thought there she is. The real one. The one who was always in there." She stepped forward. She kissed him. Not the first time there had been a first time, a careful one 3 months in standing at her door on a Tuesday evening for no particular reason, but this one was different. This one was not tentative. This one was not a question. This one was the answer. When she pulled back, she was still holding the box. "Kitchen," she said, nodding at it. "Down the hall, first door on the left," Thomas said. "I'll move the coffee maker to make room for yours." "Mine's better," she said. "Yours is stronger," he said. "That's not the same thing." "It absolutely is," she said, already walking toward the kitchen. He let her win that one. He would probably let her win most of them, not because he was conflict-averse, but because he had learned over 12 months of coffee and arguments and hallway floors, and a building meeting and terrible wine, that the pleasure of being with someone who said exactly what they meant was worth any number of debates about coffee. She put the box down on his kitchen counter. Our kitchen counter. The thought arrived so naturally and settled so comfortably that she didn't even pause at it. Just let it be true. Thomas came and stood beside her. She turned and looked at him. This man who had opened a door at 2 a.m. without knowing what he was opening it to. Who had made coffee. Who had taken the stairs. Who had sat beside her in a room full of strangers and never once stepped in front of her. Who had cried on a hallway floor and told her about it. Who had changed his jacket 4 times for a first dinner and gone back to the second one. Who had said "I already do" when she'd told him she needed to be believed while she saved herself. He had believed her. Every single time. "I used to think," Margaret said, "that love was supposed to feel safe because nothing could go wrong. Like being inside something that couldn't be touched." "And now?" Thomas asked. "Now I think it feels safe because even if something goes wrong, you're not alone in it." She looked at him. "That's different." "That's everything," Thomas said. She turned back to the box. She lifted out Charlotte's Web. First, of course, she did, and held it for a moment before setting it on the counter. "She knew more than she said," Margaret said quietly, but said exactly the right amount. Charlotte. Charlotte. Thomas picked up the book, turned it over, set it back down. "Wilbur got to live," he said. "He did," Margaret said. "Because someone believed he was worth it. They stood in the kitchen together in the quiet of a rainy morning on Clement Street, and the city went on outside, and the floors were old and loud with memory, and on the counter between them sat a book about a spider who had saved someone's life simply by telling the truth about who they were. Sometimes love does not arrive when life is perfect. Sometimes it knocks barefoot in the middle of a storm, asking for one safe place to rest. And sometimes by making room for someone else, by opening the door when everything in you has learned to keep it closed, you discover that the room was always there. That it had been waiting not for the right moment, but for the right person, to stop being afraid of what they might find inside it. Margaret Reed had knocked on the wrong door, and found on the other side of it exactly where she was supposed to be.